Welcome to the Destiny Church Tees Valley podcast. As you listen, it is our prayer that you are transformed by audacious faith, inspiring hope, and extravagant love.
Well, we're on part 4 of our Fight for Truth series. This is the finale. This is the last one. And hopefully this message will bring and tie all the ideas that we've been having a conversation about over the last few weeks. So we've looked at the armor of God and looked at the belt of truth and why truth is so important. We've looked at how truth maybe gets into our life and how it works. We've looked at some trending truths and maybe where we've been getting our truths from. Last week we looked at twisted truths, so how can we grasp the truth of God? How can we correctly handle and apply it into our life? And this week, if you're taking notes, I've titled this Grace and Truth. You see, I'm very passionate about God's truth and God's word, but I'm also very compassionate with God's people and people who do not yet know him. And sometimes you can feel like those dynamics are twisting against each other. It feels like it's a tension between loving well but standing firm on the truth. And so we want to have that conversation today about how can we love well but stand firm as well. There's a great book if you'd like to, after this message, think, I'd like to read or research a bit more about this, by Chris Hodges. He does a book called The Daniel Dilemma, and some of the ideas that I'll be unpacking today come from some of the ideas that he's explored in his book. But let's start together in the Gospel of John, in the first chapter. It says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Skip over to verse 14. It says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who comes from the Father, full of grace and truth." This is Jesus Christ. This is the manifestation of grace and truth. It is not 50% grace and 50% truth. This is 100% grace and 100% truth embodied in Jesus. And as you read stories about Jesus, you see how he embodied grace and truth. When he was with the prostitutes, he didn't go straight away and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" He was a friend of sinners. He was the friend of those who were lost. And he was around the marginalized of the time and went to their world. He listened to them. He befriended them. He engaged with their life and then said, "Hey, here's a truth that will set you free." And so we're going to have a conversation a little bit more about that to come. But you see, as Pat was so well presenting today in the persecuted church, we have a post-Christian nation here. We no longer are a pre-Christian. Some people say that we're still a Christian nation. I would suggest that we're post-Christian in the sense of we still have a generation that have heard about God, but we have a generation that still haven't heard about God. And we need to, as a generation who have heard about God, tell them the stories of our good God. We need to speak the truth and tell them in grace as well what Jesus has done for them, what will set them free. Because otherwise we know that many of our leaders and teachers, parents, doctors, politicians, musicians, etc., they're embracing a life that sometimes disobeys God, but actually they've never known him to disobey him. And we need to realize that sometimes we say they're disobeying or they're ignorant, but actually we've come out of the battle to say, let's point them towards Jesus. This is the truth. And so we need to bring ourselves back into the fight, bring ourselves back into those environments where we say, hey, this is the way, the truth, and the life. But what I love is that no matter how dark we might feel the world is getting, there is a light that shines brighter. And as we've just read, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, and it will never overcome it. Jesus didn't tell us to hide from the world. He never said, "Hey, Christians, let's bunch together. Let's just kind of do our own thing. But whatever you do, keep this the greatest secret of all time." He said, no, go into the world. Don't be of it, but go into all the world and make disciples. And sometimes we just hide the greatest message of all, and we hide from the world rather than running into it. Why is this maybe? One of the suggestions I have is because of culture. Maybe we feel like we're running away from the culture that's dictating something to us, rather than us running towards it and influencing it. We are chosen as God's ambassadors on earth. What that means is not everybody will get to know who Jesus is. But there might be that person in your life that you are Jesus to them. And are you a good representation of Jesus to them? Are you embodying grace and truth in that relationship? Are you sharing with them the hope of the world? Because if we don't run into the battle, then the culture will eat us for lunch. And as we run away, we get swallowed up into what is going on. And what I want to empower us and encourage us as a church is that we need to pick up that sword again, which is the Bible, and we need to run back into the fight. We need to be equipped, ready to give answers. We need to be equipped, ready to bring grace to situations where there is a lot of guilt and shame going on. And we need to bring truth that will not be commanding and demanding, but actually it will be setting people free. Most of my message today will be taken from the book of Daniel, so let's start there, shall we? If you go to Daniel, and just the first chapter, it's in the Old Testament. Daniel, the first 6 chapters of it is very historical. It's just explaining what's been going on with Daniel and his 3 friends, and when the people were drawn out of exile into Babylonia. And then it's the next few chapters are very prophetic. But we're going to just start off with the historic stuff. And what I find really helpful is when you're reading about Daniel's life, and you're reading about how he's faced a culture that was opposing him, how he's been taken from a nation that served and worshipped God, who knew and identified themselves as God's people, to a culture that did not identify themselves as God's people, who did not know God, who disobeyed him, and how they worked out in grace and truth. But Daniel didn't just survive the exile times, but he influenced it. And he did it so well that he didn't compromise his faith, but he also got to show God off. And hopefully, if we can take some of these lessons from Daniel and his 3 friends, that we can live in a world where maybe culture is shifting, but we don't need to compromise our faith, that we can stand firm, but also show God off as well. So if you're in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, and we're going to read from there. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. But he carried off the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians, in other words, to indoctrinate them with their culture. The king then assigned them to a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, it was Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Here we see, that a culture starts to have an impact, or shall I say, tries to have an impact on a few young men who identify themselves as God's people. But God has called us to set the culture, not to reflect the culture. In other words, we are not to be a thermometer, but a thermostat in this world. But you can only do that if you understand how culture works and what is really going on, and so we can be prepared for it. So there's 3 things that we're going to look at of what's happening in this story that also identifies with culture here today of what's going on. So number 1, culture will try to rename you. Not maybe literally giving you another name like it did with Daniel, But perhaps in your identity, the way that you will see yourself and identify yourself, culture will try to give you a new name. The Babylonians wanted to give them a new name because it meant you have a new life, you have a new owner, you are a different person. And let's look at the new names that they give them briefly. So Daniel, which originally means God is my judge, was moved into Belshazzar, which means lady, protect the king. If you think that today's culture is the only time that tries to bring in gender confusion, just go to the Old Testament. It is not a new thing. As we looked in week 2 of Trending Truths, how it's old lies but new labels. Some of these things that we're grappling with, and we're looking at how to have conversations with our families or in our workplaces, and we're thinking, how do we engage with it? Let's look at how people have already engaged with truth and grace in these difficult situations. Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious, was changed to Shadrach, which means I'm afraid of God. So every single label that the Babylonians were giving these men was to completely flip it round and to twist it and to move it from a God-centered name to a man-selfish name and to even degrade them. Michelle, which meant who he is, what God is, was to Meshach, which means I'm despised, contemptible, and humiliated. So he's gone from a man who's full of confidence to being a coward. Always trying to reverse the name. But God tries to bring redemption to every name of our life. Azariah, which originally meant Yahweh has helped. Yahweh was another word for God has helped. To Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, which was the king. So he's literally trying to change the future of him, of who is he serving, who is the purpose. And I want to awaken you today that the enemy has a label for you again today, trying to rename you. Culture will try to rename you. It means re-identifying whose you are and what you're doing on this earth, your purpose. They're the two biggest things. And if we go into a conversation or if we go into our life wandering around aimlessly, not knowing our identity securely in God, we will be washed out by what culture says our name is. But God never wanted to rename you, but he wanted to redeem you to the name that you originally had. And the beautiful concept of that. So you've got to decide, are you going to fulfill God's plan for your life? Or when culture shifts, you're just going to shift along with it and just lose a bit of identity as along the way. So number 1, culture will try to rename you. Number 2, culture will try to change your standards. So Ashpenaz was trying to make Daniel and his 3 friends eat non-Jewish food that wasn't kosher. Have any of you experienced when culture is trying to make you compromise? We've all been there. We've been there where you're put in a situation or you're in a conversation or you maybe come across something on the internet and you feel like you're in a position of compromise. But Daniel resolved himself not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. But instead he asked for permission not to defile himself in this way. So when culture shifts, we just have to keep realigning ourselves to the convictions of what we know is to be true. Sometimes we think the opposite to grace in this context is law. So we think, well, culture shifts, we just got to keep changing the law because, the law keeps changing. But actually, law and grace aren't in opposites, but law is an extension of grace. The opposite to grace, Andy Stanley says, is the absence of grace. And I think that is so true, because parents in this room know that if you have children, you create rules in your house for your children. You don't create rules for children 2 doors down from you, because they're not yours. But you create rules in your house because it's an extension of your love and your grace. You want them to tidy their rooms because you don't want to live in a world that's full of chaos and mess and taking a lot of time every day to find where stuff is. You want them to live in a world where they're eating healthy because you want them to have a great, prosperous, healthy, full life. And so you understand the rules in those situations, and it's the same way with God. when he extends his law, actually he's done it from a place of extension of grace. So when these standards are here to compromise us, when your children maybe want to compromise those rules, that's where you keep going, hey, let's keep realigning. Let's keep coming back to the why of why we have these standards in the first place. Number 3, culture will try to test you. We are going to be tested. If you have not already been tested, you will be tested one day. You will have plenty of tests in your life. But you've got to decide now, what is your response going to be? How will you stand? How will you fight in that test? We see how when Daniel was brought with this conversation about food and not wanting to eat food that wasn't kosher, then he says, well, do you know what? You can test us for 10 days. Why don't you just give us vegetables and water and fruit? And if we're not as strong and fit as the other guys in 10 days, then we'll have another conversation. But you see, the boys ended up being even stronger than the other guys. And I'm not saying this is a vegetarian thing. I eat meat. But what I am saying is that God will be faithful when you step out. And he will show that he's able to help you in all the tests. There was many more tests that came along for Daniel, as we know. This was just the first of many. If you continue to read, you will read about his 3 friends who decided they were not going to worship what the statue of gold. They said, no, our God is alive. Our God is great. We don't worship man-made things. And because of that, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. I mean, if we decided here and now not to worship things of the world, the consequences isn't fire. But yet some of us still surrender and bow to things of this world. But we need to realize that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they went into that fiery furnace, that God was with them, and God brought them out of that fire. And how extraordinary that was. But then there was the prayer test for Daniel as well, where there was this ruling that no one could pray to any other god except the king. Well, Daniel just went through his habits of his life, of he would pray 3 times a day to God. He says, I'm not going to live by this law of the land because it goes against what I believe God has told me to do. And so he prays, and he gets thrown into a lion's pit. How many of us have just not prayed because we've forgotten, in comparison to being praying in the fear of your life? Sometimes we get so complacent that we can access God 24/7. So who are you going to say who are you going to say that God is in your life is probably one of the biggest tests and one of the most common tests you will come across. Maybe just in a conversation with your mum and just inquisitive of why are you going to church? What is this all about? Or maybe it's with your boss of why do you want Monday nights off for your Connect group? Tell me a bit more about this. Or maybe it's in other atmospheres where it's a bit more toxic and you have to feel like you keep giving answers for why you believe what you believe. Tests will come, that's absolutely certain. But remember that God is always with his people, wherever you are. He has never, ever let his people down throughout all of history. He has never let us down now, and he never will let us down. And we can learn from Daniel and his 3 friends examples of faith and trust, but we can also learn to show God off in those moments of when we get tested to say, hey, do you know what? My God is with me and he's never forsaken me. And we can show him off, not just in that moment, but then a whole nation can bow down to the true one King. How beautiful is that? So culture will continue to keep shifting. It will continue to keep changing. That is the way things go. But as a people of God, we've got to decide, how are we going to respond? How are we going to be the ambassadors for Jesus in grace and truth? Now, sometimes what happens is we will fall into 2 extremes of a camp. We will be either all grace and no truth, or we will be all truth and no grace. And neither of them are right. Sometimes we can be like, well, it's the truth, don't sugarcoat it. Or other times we can go to the extreme of, well, we end up loving people more than we think God loves them. And, I know the Bible says this, but a loving God would never say this. Or I know that, God calls us out to our sin, but, I think I can handle this. And so we dwell in these two camps where actually they're supposed to be brought together. Now, one great way that this is brought together, and Jesus shows it when I shared it at the beginning, Jesus, friend of sinners, is that it's relationally. And so the biggest thing that we can do to proclaim grace and truth, to be ambassadors for Jesus in this world as we fight for truth, is that we connect with people before we correct. We connect with people well before we ever correct them. Let me explain this a little bit, and it might hopefully identify with some ideas that you have. For me, I fell into a camp where I was, this is the truth, and it will set you free. And when I was 12 years old, I was in my RE lesson, and in all fairness, probably any lesson at school, if any situation came up, if there was ever a conversation that was ever religious, or even, to be honest, political, I was able to have the conversation, often me against the teacher and the class, because I was alone. And I was able to have a good conversation and to argue my case well, whatever the topic was. I would often win the conversations and win the fight, in the sense of people would back down because I'd showed them the issues with their arguments. However, I had this conversation I was 12 years old, as I said, and I was in my RE class, and the conversation was abortion. And so I was talking about pro-life. But little did I realize in my conversation that there was a young girl next to me that had gone through abortion. Now, for me, in my ignorance, you might call it, I disregarded the people behind the conversations. And in that moment, I realized, and I had to make a decision. Do I decide to win arguments or win people? And I came to this realization that we are not called to win arguments as Christians, but to save people and point them to Jesus. I decided to repent of where I've been too harsh and judged people on Christian standards that never were even saved in the first place. And even though my truth prevailed, I said, I need the grace. Because God has given me so much grace. He hasn't just cast judgment over my life. He's given me so much grace. And so then I changed my approach. I said, I need to connect. I need to listen to people's stories. Now, yes, the truth is fully 100% the truth. But I don't go into those conversations without knowing the people first. I like to call them table conversations. And this young girl that I knew, I got to know her really well and brought her into even our youth group. And because of the difference in the way that I enrolled my faith as an ambassador for God, I moved from just winning the fights to bringing my whole class to a youth service. And they all got to hear the gospel message. How extraordinary. That's not about me. That is the grace of God, and that is the truth prevailing and set them free. Now, not all of them accepted the altar call, but many of them did. But here's the difference. Many of them heard the message that I was trying to say at 12 years old. But at 14, when I was able to bring them into the youth service, they heard it in the light that it was supposed to be shared at a level that was a relational and at a level that wasn't to bring shame and guilt, but to actually set them free. And I wonder if sometimes that we have the right ambition and we have the right drive, in a sense, to a life that we want to bring the hope into the world. But actually, we're all truth and no grace. Or perhaps we're all grace and given a license for everything because, it makes you happy, and we've got no truth, and we need to bring that in. And what I want to encourage us is that we need to bring them both together, because truth without grace is just mean. And grace without truth is meaningless. But grace and truth together is like good medicine. And if we can learn to bring them in harmony together, yes, it can feel like a balancing act. Yes, it can feel like a tension. But if we can learn to use them together to connect before we ever correct, then we will see the transformational truth come onto our nation. Truth without grace often leads to rebellion. As parents of their teenagers, if they abstain from a relationship, it's probably the quickest way for that teenager to be rebellious. That's why relationship is so key. There are many sociologists and psychologists that are showing how much you need relationship to actually share the truth with somebody. And these are non-Christians. They're saying people don't actually just listen to somebody. You might be hearing me now and just let the words bounce back off you. But if it was somebody you know and you respect, then you'd hear the words. And how do we need to be friends of sinners? Not judging sinners, but friends of sinners, because we know that we have all fallen short and that we have all sinned. We started off in the first week, we shared about a story from John 8 of how Jesus did this in action. How there was a lady who was caught in an adulterous act, and the Pharisees brought her to Jesus. We know that their intention was to trap Jesus, but Jesus used this platform that was used to test him, to glorify and show God off. And he says, if any of you are without sin, you cast the first stone. Because if you were caught in adultery, it was a punishment worth of death. Well, as we all know, we have all fallen short, and so every single one of them, the eldest starting first, walked away. And then Jesus turned to the young woman and said that, I neither condemn you, there's grace. But then Jesus declared, now leave your life of sin, there is truth. That is how grace and truth work together. Grace invites you to be free, so the truth can set you free. A verse that we often twist, if you were with us on last week's message, we were looking at twisted truths and how sometimes we can use the Bible verses out of context. Here's a verse that we often twist. Matthew 7, verses 1 to 2, it talks about do not judge. And it's probably one of the most twisted verses by non-Christians, which I find great that they're quoting the Bible. It'd be great if they quoted it in context, of course. But it's actually hurtful when we use this out of context, and it can hurt our witness. Because in this context, let me explain what do not judge is about. It's actually talking about not being hypocritical about our judgment, and it's not about being superficial with our judgment. It's also never holding a Christian to Christian standards. They got to get to know Jesus first before they get to know how to live. And we've also got to help people who have fallen short to be restored. So it's not about do not judge. It's about grace and truth together. I'm going to go into a response in a moment, but before I do, I want you just to think of where maybe have you fallen short of you're on the grace or on the truth. And this is not to condemn you, like I said, but this is for you to be aware and alert of which camp do you maybe have more of a tendency to lean on, and which one do you feel like you need to grow in and learn in. Is it truth? Do you need to equip yourself more with the Bible? Do you need to read more? Do you need to learn more? Do you need to be more active in your connect groups to understand what the truth is so that you can set people free? Or perhaps it's the grace. Maybe you just need to realize that we all need grace in our life, and that God has given us the greatest example of grace, where he could judge us to death, and he did, but then he sent his son to take the death penalty for us. And so maybe we need to see that juxtaposition, that beautiful harmony with grace and truth. In 1 Peter 3, verse 5, it says this, 15, it says this, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And sometimes, I know I've stopped there. In memorizing this verse, I've stopped there. But if we carry on, it says this, but do this with gentleness and respect. We need to be prepared in and out of season. Yes, with our testimonies, yes, with the word of God. But very rarely have I ever had somebody come up to me, explain how you know the Bible is true. But really, they come up to me to see if I'm living the truth, if I'm integrity with what I'm saying and my actions and my lifestyle. And so often we need to have a reason for our hope. We need to have a reason for why we believe in Jesus. We need to have a reason for our faith. We need to be able to have discussions and conversations and to show people the way to Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. But we need to do this with grace. We need to do this with gentleness and respect. If you think about yourself and your journey towards Jesus. Maybe you're not there yet, maybe you're on your way. But if you identify yourself as a Christian today, how did you become a Christian? Was it because you heard someone just shouting a message on the street? Was it because you had a leaflet that was dropped through your door? Was it because you turned on the TV and you heard something? Now, many of these people do fall in these camps, and that's great. But the statistics are so small on this, and it's great that there's still statistics on it. But how about if it's somebody you know that has brought you to church? Or it's somebody that you love that has told you about Jesus? Over 80, nearly 90% of people who have become a Christian, it is through relational evangelism. We need to connect with people before we ever correct them. Even God demonstrated this for us. He connected with his people, the Israelites. He brought them out of slavery. He took them across the Red Sea, and he provided them with the manna, the food from heaven. And then he gave them the 10 Commandments. He connected with them before he corrected them. Can we connect with people in our life, with the sinners around us, with grace and truth? There's a song that's going to play behind me, and it's called Another in the Fire. And it's a beautiful poetic song by Hillsong that shares some of the ideas and themes through Daniel and through the Israelites going across the sea of how God is always with us. You see, what's beautiful about us having to do the grace and truth, being ambassadors for Jesus, is that we're not alone in doing this. It's not your own strength, it's not your own talents and your abilities to be able to go make disciples, but actually you take your abilities and let the Spirit breathe all over it. And you see, no matter which situation you are in, no matter how far you feel you're in the darkness, the light always shines in the darkness. And Jesus is always there with you in every single test you are going through. And so as we just hear this song, let it minister to you. But I also encourage you to take hold of your communication cards. And maybe you feel like you need to, your Connect cards now they're called. Fancy name. Take hold of your Connect cards, and why don't you just write on there maybe what your next step is? Why don't you say, hey, I'm going to actually choose to run back into this fight of truth. I ran away as culture shifted and I've just ran away from it, or I've let it change my identity and I've let it dictate what I should be doing and compromise my standards, but I'm going to run back into the fight. Maybe it's that, hey, I've been in all the truth camp and I actually need to have it with grace. Or maybe it's, I've just been all grace, I need it with truth as well. Whatever's been speaking to you, let these words minister to you and set you free this morning.
If you would like to know more, please visit us at www.thedestinychurch.co.uk.